the key is not to save your particular identity. The key is to somehow invite your particular identity to die to the universal while you're still a particular. And then that way you can enter into an immortal body before you die. But that means you have to die.
This is what I see as what Platonism is, right? It's this constant demand to transform, like always, like this kind of ability of the human spirit to overcome, and through the questioning, through philosophical activity.
So it's this idea that, in a sense, call it the universal, call it the eternal, they call it the noetic heavens. We enter into this universality, as you described it, in a sense, by learning to release ourselves in some way.
Welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. In this episode, our hosts take up the question of syncretism. The question of syncretism becomes of fundamental importance when we try to think cross-culturally, and certainly when we attempt to think historically. Indeed, the question of syncretism is not just about how we might think two traditions that seem, at least on their face, to diverge, such as Tantra and Platonism, but it is also the question of perennialism. In doing so, our hosts grapple with the history of dualism in the Western tradition and its persistence for us today. By the end of the episode, the figure of Jesus arrives, allowing us to consider the incarnation event and a broader discussion on transformation in terms of the particular and the universal. As was the case last week, the emphasis is not just on understanding what it might mean to die into the universal or totally empty oneself, but also the very experience of this metaphorical death and emptying. It is not enough, they argue, to just talk about these ideas, but the Platonic tradition, through figures like Plotinus, Proclus, and Iamblichus, urge us to take up the challenge to actualize these experiences in our own lives. Thank you so much for joining us again. We hope you enjoy.
So we're on?
Yeah, we're on. And I'll start off with the question that I think is the 25-cent word, or what I tell my students is the cocktail party word that we're actually going to be using quite a lot today, and that is the word syncreticism or syncretic. What does that mean to you as a person in the world of Platonism with regards to being historians or artists or philosophers? So.
Well, I was trained.
Yeah. Yeah. Define syncretism for me.
Yeah. Syncretism, as I pronounce it, is the, combining traits or images or qualities of different religions that for some reason, depending on who the people are that are involved, they find themselves combining these characteristics of what were separate different religious traditions. And oftentimes it happens naturally when cultures come together. And the kind of syncretism that we might be engaged in as scholars is that we see similarities in traditions, and then we find comparative, functional similarities or functional identical functions in different traditions. And so we put them together, and that's a different kind of syncretism. It's not so much natural out of the religious traditions, but it's sort of artificial, created by scholars. So I think what you're asking us today is, at least in my case, how I ended up putting Tantra together with theurgy, and then Gareth can pick it up for what you think you might be asking him, and you can take it on your side.
Yeah, Gareth.
That's how I understand syncretism. Yeah.
Yeah. So I have been very interested for quite a while in this confluence, if you like, of symbolic understanding between different kinds of traditions. How we understand an idea, which I will maybe come back to a little bit later on, the logos spermatikos, this kind of idea of a kind of, divine seed, if you like, that emerges or makes itself apparent in different kinds of social, cultural, historical environments, geographies, contexts. And one of the things I'd like to talk a little bit about today, and which we'll maybe touch on in different ways, is for me the interesting emergence and development of a kind of Platonic language and Platonic symbolism within some of the church fathers, and particularly within some of the hesychastic and mystical writings of the Philokalia, where we find this very interesting kind of connection between a language which is at once Platonic in some ways and refers to familiar symbols and stories, but which is also transformed and taken into the Trinitarian doctrines of Christian thought, and how, the working out and development of Christian theology from its mystical forms into its dogmatic forms, and their interrelationship sits alongside the continuation of a Platonic tradition into Neoplatonic thought. And then furthermore, how after that, and really to the present day, this kind of back and forth, if you like, what we could maybe call Christian Platonism or Christian Neoplatonism. So this kind of back and forth between these symbols and stories and theologies becomes this nourishing and continual kind of stream, this energy which we find represented in a lot of poetry and art and so on. So I guess I'll be speaking principally about the European tradition in a way. But in another sense, I understand the syncretic to relate to another term which we've talked about before, which is the perennial or perennialism or Sophia perennis. The idea that there is a kind of perennial wisdom or understanding which we can access in different ways, and that the mode of revelation of that wisdom, if you like, takes on forms in relation to different cultures and places. And I think one interesting way of describing this maybe, and this is to quote the poet Kathleen Raine, she talks about Neoplatonism as being, she says, the kind of local idiom in the kind of European context of a kind of perennial wisdom. So, within that particular socio-cultural historical milieu, we have this kind of particular kind of form where that wisdom emerges and is realized and represented in art, in poetry, in philosophy. And maybe that's it's something you find differently represented in the Vedantic tradition, let's say, or in other kinds of world spiritual cultures.
Great, great. You only just, yeah, I was going to ask that, right? Because here, how is it that we can be thinking about a kind of perennial form of philosophy, right? Particularly as Platonic, right? Is Platonism adverse, or would it demand this kind of perennial wisdom that doesn't actually have a set dogma but can emerge like wildflower in pretty much any culture due to certain symbols, certain ideas that can kind of spark a revival, a reemergence, or an integration, an invitation? So I'm thinking here of Tantra, where I go back and forth because, Greg and Sarah Abel-Rapp introduced me to the Tantric tradition, and I remember being immediately flabbergasted with the parallels and believing that their work was absolutely essential, showing that it's not a neat conversation where a lot of scholars are like, oh, the East was people took and appropriated ideas from the East, and oh, they're awful, they don't give credit for it. And no, it's a much more complex, nuanced journey of a variety of different cross-cultural encounters and dialogues and transformations and growths, so that there isn't one that is older or better, but it really is about the kind of how is it they blended together to create unique religious traditions, spiritual traditions, while at the same time still having that weird spark that makes it perennial. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Um, you know, how would I say this? I got to the tantric comparison with Neoplatonic theurgy because I was frustrated by what I thought was the approach of scholars to understanding Neoplatonic theurgy. And I actually wrote out a little story. I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but how would I put it? I had, before I was introduced to theurgy, I'd already been practicing theurgic rituals without knowing it. I'd been chanting mantras as a yogi outside of Phoenix, and I experienced the moment where I was no longer chanting mantras, the mantras were chanting me. And that allowed me to sort of dissolve into the entire landscape through the medium of the mantra. So I was asked by a professor at UC Santa Barbara to read Iamblichus's On the Mysteries and then read E.R. Dodd's critique of theurgy in the appendix to On the Greeks and the Irrational. And when I read Iamblichus, I realized that he was describing exactly what I had experienced with the mantras, because he said, you don't so much pray, but you allow the prayer to pray you, or that the inexplicable sounds that you recite have agential power. You just become receptive to let them work their divine magic on you. And when I read Dodds, I realized that he didn't know that. And he was very dismissive of the entire theurgic enterprise. And so I wrote a paper where I critiqued Dodds's approach. And he was a Victorian rationalist and really brilliant guy, fantastic scholar. And for him, Plotinus was the very peak of Platonism, and anything after Plotinus was a sort of diminishment. And he saw Iamblichus as a profoundly misguided journey into superstition and chanting, meaningless sounds and that sort of thing. So I wrote a paper explaining how I thought that what Iamblichus was doing was Platonic if you understand Platonism in a different way from the way Dodds understood Platonism. I understood Platonism as a transformative tradition, a mystagogic tradition, and that Iamblichus's theurgy was a way of effecting that in a very powerful style. And that basically became my dissertation. That's basically what I've been writing about since then. That's all. That's the only thing I really know. But what I realized was that, and I think people appreciated what I wrote and said, yeah, it is Platonism, but I don't know that it really sank in, or sunk in, I should say. People continue to interpret theurgy as in a Plotinian way, that it's a way to get up and out of this world and to join some other world with the gods up there. And they seem to miss the fact that Iamblichus said that matter is divine, that the gods are supposed to manifest themselves through us. The goal of theurgy is to become an embodied demiurge. And so I thought all this notion of interpreting theurgy as all anagogic, all getting up and escaping, that's putting it into a Plotinian framework that it doesn't belong in. And I didn't think that by just saying that over and over, it would really help. So when I read the tantric material, I recognized that they were saying exactly what Iamblichus was saying in a theurgic context. The parallels were really striking. They use mantras. They have an emphasis on a subtle body. They have the microcosm and macrocosm idea. Matter is not evil. The whole idea is that the God comes down into us, possesses us. It seemed that the tantric tradition was doing exactly what the theurgic tradition was doing. So I thought, maybe I can use Tantra to invite Western scholars to see theurgy in a different way from the way that we've been seeing it which is the Platonian model. And that's the long and the short of how I got into comparing theurgy and tantra, was as a way to make theurgy more understandable. And I don't claim to be an expert in tantra, but I learned enough of it to know how to make that comparison, I would say.
Can you, because one of the things that frustrates me about academic Platonism is the insistence or the constant insistence of dualism within Plato, right? And the Platonic tradition. And it strikes me as just, if you read Plato and you read the Neoplatonists, that is just a straw man, right? Like they're like all of the Platonists, not a one of them, nary a one, to kind of sound like Blake in the future, would in fact insist on such a rigid dualism, right? Sure, there is an importance of being able to conceptually think distinctions and differences, because we're dialecticians. We need to be able to understand the differences between, say, the body and the mind, or the soul or the spirit. Like all of these things help us get in tune and to kind of have contact with the beauty and the divinity of all of these different layers. But at the end of the day, all of it is brought together within a beautiful plurality that is still one. You know, that's the like what Platonism was really about, is that how do we reconcile the paradox of being both a one and a two, both a body and a soul? Like, how is it that we integrate, you know, the thumos and the epithumos and the nous and all of these things? It is, you know, like this therapane. It's a practice of you know, attending to who it is that you say that you are. And so, yeah, maybe we could speak on that for a few minutes, to talk about, like, why do we think that there is this insistence on a dualism, and how might that be part of the reason why we don't tend to see Platonism in all of these other traditions that revere the body, revere the soul's, you know, embodied resurrection or recreation or transformation. Yeah, I don't want to, you know, spoil the soup. So,
Well, I don't want to be the only one that responds to this, but this is part of what I went through. Before I got into Platonism, I was a yogi, and I meditated all the time, and I tried to overcome my body. I tried to become independent of all of the material attractions and repulsions that any good yogi is, you know, is exposed to. And I was an ascetic for years. And after a while, I realized that this disparagement of my body and a material world was a dead end. And it's very much of a dualist kind of way of looking at things, to get out of the body. And unfortunately, I don't think that Plotinus was a dualist, but he does express himself in dualist language occasionally. And it has led some people to interpret him in a dualistic way. And if you look at Christianity, even though it's got the emphasis on the incarnation of God in human form, the emphasis is on the other world, and that the incarnation tends to be interpreted only in one person, Jesus Christ. It does have the notion of theosis, and it's possible, but there's a sense that there's something a little dirty about being in a body and having all the material attractions and emotions. And I thought that theurgy, as I understood it with the Iamblichus, it does inherit some of that language of looking at material attractions as something to get over and get through, but it doesn't stop there. But that doesn't answer your question, is what was the function? Why are people so attracted to dualism? And I'm not quite sure I have the answer to that. Not right at this moment. I haven't thought of answering that.
I often think of it as exactly what Plato was trying to, like, push against, right? Because it's not that people are attracted to dualism; they're attracted to the ways of life that can be had or can be understandable when we can cut ourselves off from the mystical or the transcendent, and we can just say, I'm only a body, I'm only atoms in the void, I am a mere meaningless nothing, right? And so dualism, I think, just perpetuates like this kind of dichotomy that most people want, so that it's easier to say no to the more than. At least that's my instinct, right?
When you say no to the more than,
Yeah.
What's the more than that they're saying no to?
That's what I think that they want to make. I think that historically the hoi polloi or the academic philosopher, or those who want to make their bread and butter as professors rather than have a vocation, right? Like what they want is kind of secular, neat, clean world where this is rationalism and it's a tool that we use in order to be better meat potatoes, better just random contingent things on this earth, or just trying to survive, right? That's all reason is. And so any of those philosophers out there that they're saying that there's something transcendent, that reason actually is part and parcel of integrating ourselves with that spiritual, that soul, that possibility of becoming like a god, of that body, whether it be the hangnail on your toe or the ringing in your ears, that all of that has a kind of symbolic beauty to it, just as much as the painting of Sophia or Mary or what it might be. But as long as you're comporting yourself to that, I don't think people want to comport themselves to a world where there's more than just atoms in the void, the Epicurean kind of idea that we're all just contingent objects of chance.
I'm still not sure what you mean. People are not comfortable comporting themselves with a world that's beyond just the materialist atom world. They're uncomfortable with doing that, you're saying?
Yeah, and I think that's why they reinforce dualisms, right? Where there's the people who believe in transcendence or in Christian or the more than, they become the manic. They become the silly people of fantasy, of imagination, obviously not in reality. And so that's why.
Okay. So we might dismiss them as sort of new age fantasizers.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
It makes
Okay.
it easier to say.
Well, because they don't believe that imagination has any reality.
Mm-hmm,
They
exactly.
disparage imagination. Imagination is not real for them. They don't understand that imagination has power. That in fact, the very world they're living in has been imagined.
Yes.
And they're imagining a completely materialist world, but they don't realize that they're imagining it.
Yep.
And they don't realize that imagination has the power to open up to other worlds as well. They're really stuck in a very narrow way of imagining, it seems to me.
No, I
And
mean, I can't help but think of Nietzsche here, right? Where, it's all will to power. It's all, and like what's strange is that they're creating a world that is a life denying, that says no to the beauty of this world. Like they're creating, so they're making something, and they know it's ugly, but they keep saying yes to the ugly, to the abysmal, to the rot and the stench and to the death, rather than saying, no, I can create a world of immortality, and not create it as mere fantasy, but no, as you just said, with the power of the imaginal, as somebody like Quoben would say, or Blake would say, I believe. Right, Gareth? I assume.
Yeah, well, Blake,
well,
there's imagination as a representation of what really exists truly and unchangeably. And yeah, you think of the marriage of heaven and hell. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is infinite. For man has closed himself up till he sees all things through narrow chinks of his cavern. So we have that kind of, Platonic image again. Yeah, I mean, well, when you were talking about Christianity, I don't know, I'm not sure I agreed entirely with what you said there, but I think that I was thinking of 1 Corinthians, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit, and these kinds of ideas. But I think certainly within aspects of Christianity, there is this, denigration, let's call it, of the body, and a focus more on the transcendent than the immanent, let's say. But I'm interested in what you said about iamblichus, because I was thinking about I'll read a brief quote here. This is the Orthodox scholar Andrew Louth quoting another scholar, Andrei von Ivanka. The phenomenon which characterizes the whole of the first millennium of Christian theological thought is the use of Platonism as the form for its philosophical expression, and the framework of the world picture in terms of which the proclamation of revealed truths was made. In other words, Christian Platonism. And I was interested there because, we've spoken a little bit about to what extent we think of Plotinus or Plato as dualists, and certainly one could probably find evidence or justifications for the case that they're both one or the other. I think you could look at earlier dialogues in Plato to later dialogues and find a kind of difference, if you like, between this relationship of immanence and transcendence. And of course, you mentioned the incarnation, and we think of this in some senses, obviously, as both an historical event, but as a kind of ontological event insofar as the Logos is in the beginning. So the Logos is the creative energy of man, if you like. But the point I wanted to get to is this idea, and I was interested to hear that about Iamblichus, with whom I'm not that familiar, about perhaps this unrecognized or overlooked kind of interdependence or interrelationship between the higher and the lower, between, let's say, body and soul, or the heavens and earth, because this is also something, of course, that you find being worked out in early the early centuries AD in terms of Christian theologians. And one example of that would be the 5th century Saint Diadochos of Photiki. For instance, he says, he who loves God consciously in his heart is known by God. For the degree that he receives the love of God consciously in his soul, he truly enters into God's love. And I'll miss a few parts here, but he is both present in this life and not present in it, still dwelling in the body, yet he departs from it, as through love he ceaselessly journeys towards God in his soul. So, there is this sort of sense of going out of oneself, but also remaining. And this, of course, is a key theological idea about the Logos. It's the word that sort of goes forth but remains at the same time. And I don't know, I mean, maybe these are part of a bigger kind of question about to why, if we kind of entertain this narrative that there was more of a dualist tendency, let's say, in the the period before Christ, let's say, in the centuries BC to the early centuries AD, even if we ignored the incarnation event, let's say, but why these sort of thoughts and resolutions or attempts to redeem or somehow, wrestle with this relationship between the body and the way in which perhaps it was denigrated in earlier thinkers with the transcendent. So Iamblichus, from what I understand you were saying, is doing that. And we have these early theologians doing this as well, working it out as part of Christian dogmatics. Now, I would say in a very sweeping statement here that I see this partly, certainly in the kind of Western tradition, as part of a bigger narrative about our move or transition from a more kind of immanently participated being to a kind of more individualistic, subjective kind of existence, which we find, amplified, particularly after scientific revolution and into our own period. That's maybe a longer discussion for another time, but just thinking about that period, where we're talking about, I mean, Iamblichus is what is it, 3rd and 4th century? Am I right? I'm sorry if I'm mistaken.
Yeah, it's fine.
And so the thinker I just quoted is sort of 5th century. So, there is this kind of, we find these interesting parallels, of course we do. As we do with Dionysius the Areopagite and Proclus and all these kinds of connections. So there's some kind of working out going on, isn't there? There's something emergent in trying to, tackle this this sunderance of which we're aware, this sense of how we, as you beautifully described, somehow seek to escape the body, but then have to resolve ourselves to our inhabitants within it, and to sort of not see those things as being so split. There's a bit of a rambling question, but I mean, I was really interested in how that connects to what you said a bit earlier.
Well, I mean, just to tag along here, like, but this is what I see as what Platonism is, right? Is this constant demand to transform, like always, like this kind of ability of the human spirit to overcome, and through the questioning, through philosophical activity, so that yes, Plato can appear to be a dualist in the Phaedo, but then offer this beautiful cosmos that is alive and living, and a god in the Timaeus, because it's about this, like, I've got this idea, I'm going to get it out, I'm going to express this logos, this idea, and not hesitate to see that it is divine, but still worthy of transformation, still worthy of engagement and becoming otherwise. And so for me, when I think about why Platonism is so adaptable and why it's so inspiring, is because it's trying to get you to see that it's doing the work, right, of reconciling these questions, but knowing it's infinite, it's insatiable, so that 100 years from now there's going to be some other person wrestling with what Platonism is, what the body soul is, with what dialectic can do versus what spiritual inspiration can do, because that's what I see as the problem. Is most people don't want to live the life of perplexity and asking questions. They see it as empty, as meaningless, as Thales falling into the well, as that degree that you should never get unless you want to be a barista. And it's like, no, no, it helps you to recognize that the true power, the true source of beauty and truth and wisdom is in the life that refuses to be dogmatic. So that even when Platonists become dogmatic, it's very short-lived, like within the Platonic tradition. Like most of the time, you're gonna get a revival, you're gonna get a Plotinus, you're gonna get an Iamblichus, you're gonna get, a Kathleen Raine, and I would, argue, all of the contemporary philosophers that I find myself attracted to, even though they don't appear to be Platonist, there's that je ne sais quoi that inspires generations to remember beauty, to remember the value of wisdom. And so, anyways, going back, yeah.
Let me sort of ride that wave a little bit, and I'll also use as a sort of get a little traction off of something that Gareth said when you talked about the incarnation event, which is significant in the Christian imagination. In the Platonic imagination, there is no incarnation event. I would have to say that the incarnation event has always happened and will always happen, and it never didn't happen. The incarnation event is right there. It's manifested in nature, and it serves, as I understand it from Iamblichus's view, as a kind of invitation to us in our particular kind of suffering and wondering, why the fuck am I here? And what's my life about? Why do I want more than just, this or that, whether it's sitting in a class and memorizing formulas, or digging a ditch, or filling up coffee cups? Why is it that I want something a whole lot more significant? And there's a hunger in us as particular beings for something that's maybe more universal. And that hunger for the universal is what I think you were talking about, Danny, where you go from Plato's idea of the Phaedo, where we're kind of in the body and we're trapped and we got to get away from this being trapped, to the Timaeus, where no, it's not a trap, it's a flowing out, and we enter into the incarnational event as co-incarnational beings. And that seems to be the goal, in my opinion, of Platonism. And I think that people will express it differently in different times. And the reason that it might seem Platonic is because I think some of these themes are universal. It's how do we, as particular beings faced with death, deal with all of the fears and hungers that we have as particular beings, not get stuck in our particularity, whatever it might be, and not even try to overcome it to achieve some sort of perpetual or immortal particularity, which is how the heaven world is usually imagined in a lot of traditions, whether it's Christian or Buddhist or whatever, that I'm going to be going somewhere perfect forever. You even lose that because you enter into the flow of the incarnation event, that God is always manifesting itself as life, and we're part of that. And we kind of are a little bit of afraid of it because we don't want to dissolve into the infinite, but ultimately we are going to dissolve into the infinite. I'm not entirely sure that's the case. I sometimes like to believe that if you do enough work while you're in the body and with your imagination, there might be some kind of other life after our body dies, a kind of, the Tibetans talk about it, or Christians talk about an angelic form. The Chaldeans talked about Plato was in an angelic form, and he transmitted some of the oracles in his angelic form. Is it possible that maybe it's not just a dissolve, that we could achieve some sort of angelic identity by dying before we die, as the Sufis like to say, we enter into an immortal body before our mortal body dies. And if that could happen, I think that would be cool, and that's what I would like. But the part of it that appeals to me I don't know if I trust that part of myself that it appeals to me for, but it's the particular and the universal. Go ahead with that.
No, I absolutely love that. Like this idea, because this is why the Neoplatonists have all of these various different hierarchies with regards to, and in the Christians as well, right? Like you've got the human being, you've got the hero, you've got the daimon, you've got the angelic, and then you've got gods, all here at the
angels, archangels, right.
all at the cosmic, right? Not to mention going further up as far as ascent is concerned. And why would they be advancing these ladders unless, in some sense, they're grasp and they're helping us think them? Like what happens when we actually think them but then also experience them, bring them within? Like if Heraclitus is right, there are fathoms when you search within, and if the absolutely infinite is truly absolutely infinite, that means that there truly could be a kind of miraculous shift to the angelic, or a miraculous shift to theosis, so on and so forth.
And how else do we explain the fact that some of these people, like Proclus or Iamblichus, were able to do supernormal things while they were in a body? And where does that sort of and yogis? There's stories about yogis have supernatural powers. Where does that come from? They must be tapping into something more than just a particular. If maybe we just say, well, none of that ever did happen and everybody just made it up. But I don't believe so. I think sometimes these things do happen. I think some of us has even witnessed some of these things. So I'd like to believe that there is a more than this materialist world where we're in. And I think that we can do better than to think we can just, save our particular. The key is not to save your particular identity. The key is to somehow invite your particular identity to die to the universal while you're still a particular. And then that way you can enter into an immortal body before you die. But that means you have to die before you die.
Gareth, I would arguably say this is what the Christian tradition would call kenosis, right? To the emptying of oneself. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, I think a lot of what Greg said earlier, I wouldn't disagree with from a Christian theological perspective as being also very pertinent and relevant to how those ideas have been worked out. I suppose obviously there's a certain kind of eschatological significance to the horizontal vertical axes, if you like, of Christ coming into human form at a particular point in time, and how this relates to questions of salvation, and powerfully, of course, and most profoundly, the image of the cross as this kind of redemptive symbol of kenosis, deification, the kind of redemption of time and eternity, if you like, and these kinds of ideas. Yeah, and I was thinking because just thinking about what you just said right at the end there, Greg, and thinking about Plotinus, the alone to the alone, or you're thinking of St. Paul, it is not I that live, but Christ that lives in me. And so there is this sense of some kind of giving over. And funnily enough, I'd made some notes of my own about this idea, of course, that we find in Plato and in the Gospels of dying to be reborn. Or we can think of the myth of in the end of the Republic, and so how these kind of stories are, because I believe, and I think this is a false distinction, but let's put it this way. I believe sort of rationally and let's say mystically that there's good philosophical arguments for the immateriality of the soul and for the nature of our eternal existence and so on. But I also think that there's a truth to the symbolic ways that these ideas come to us through the very things we're talking about today, which are really fundamental to the very kind of fabric of our being. And they're not just stories, they are real representations of very deeply embedded ideas and principles and natures of our very selves. And so they're both representational to some extent, but also actual. And Yeah, so I mean, I think this is an important question. This idea of how we overcome that. And I was reading recently something by Pope Benedict when he was Cardinal Ratzinger, and it refers to Galatians, to the thing I just quoted of St. Paul. And I think it's really interesting in the context of what you said. If you'd allow me to just read it briefly, he says, the act of faith is an eminently personal act anchored in the most intimate depths of the human I. But precisely by being so personal, it's at the same time an act of communication. In its most intimate nature, faith is therefore a way of being with someone, of shattering that isolation of my I, which is also its malady. The act of faith opens out onto the distant horizon, breaking down the barriers of my subjectivity. So it's this idea that, in a sense, call it the universal, call it the eternal, they call it the noetic heavens. We enter into this universality, as you described it, in a sense, by learning to release ourselves in some way. And I think we're both describing different kinds of articulations of that that happening. But of course, it's something we're so reluctant to do, isn't it? Because in some sense, maybe this brings us back to the material body and the kind of seduction of a certain kind of comfort with that idea that there's some resistance within us to wanting to really die in that sense,
You better believe it.
to
Well,
die. Yeah.
and to be platonic, like there's some resistance to the erotic, to love, right? To accept that the problem of participation was never Plato's problem, right? That the problem of that participation is of necessity, but so many of us want to just, oh, no, I'm just an isolated individual. That doesn't mean anything. People would prefer a world without love, without the kind of, yes, we are connected to the something more than, right? That everything is saturated with this, and that we need to figure out ways to sustain that realization and that experience and that sensation. And so no, I mean, I just find that to be like, that's the heart of it, is that why do some people want
Be-
a problem of participation?
People don't want it because it leads to suffering.
Mm,
As soon as you realize that you're cut off, you're hurting. And
mm,
as soon as you realize you're cut off, you're entering into that erotic need.
mm,
You know, you need that connection, and that hurts. So sometimes people just want to shut down their capacity to feel,
mm.
to avoid hurting. But I noticed that I know that Robert, you're quietly sitting here, engaging this whole thing, but you did make a post that I thought was kind of interesting, and I wondered whether you wanted to tell us something about metanoia, because you thought that it related to what we were talking about. Is it all right if I invite Robert to
Of course.
to jump in
No,
and
we're Platonists who don't like other people.
well, I don't know the protocols. I mean, I've run afoul of some people sometimes by being too
Oh,
open to including.
no,
Yeah,
I like to run all things with the spirit of grace and just have the fun and be the good. So
maybe Robert doesn't want to say anything about metanoia. I don't know.
Oh no, I love it. I think do you know Tanabe? Do you know the Kyoto school philosophers, Greg?
No, I don't know Tanabe. No.
Well,
So tell us
they,
what you want
they
to share with
have
us.
their religious world is mediated by absolute nothingness. So they don't have these kind of attachments to like, who is this historical true Nietzsche? Because if we don't know the true Nietzsche, then how can we know the truth? And so they would challenge, I think, Christians to want a more mediated by nothing version of Kenosis and Kenosis and stuff like that, which then honors the world, because they also have like a very rich poetic tradition in Japan that synthesizes well with Buddhism and Zen and the ideas of nothingness they have. But yeah, I love that, like the idea of self-emptying, and you can't do it consciously. You have to, it's like a participatory, like consciousness and other power, because you really, Tanabe, maybe too much, but quite a bit, talks about Shin Buddhism, which has a kind of almost, what were you guys talking about, like chanting? It has almost like this gestural kind of chanting gesture that they kind of do when they pray, and they go, oh, it's all nothing or something. And then if they do that 23 times, then they're transported into the Pure Land. And it's like, oh, if that's two worlds, that's terrifying, because then what if that portal opens up and demons come through? But if it's symbolic and it's like a metanoia from suffering to non-suffering, then it's like, it's not that different than like a Christian redemption, or like a Platonic participation or something like that. That makes like a Socratic aporia make sense. It's like, how can people leave an argument without an answer, but desiring to want to do the process again or something?
Well, when you mentioned that they're doing these chants, and the chants open up into a nothingness, and from that nothingness they enter into a transcendent experience, I somehow think that learning how to trick the mind into not its habitual state of controlling its thinking is part of what Platonism aims at, also through the example of Socrates. He paralyzes people, he stops them, and I think it has the same thing can be effected through prayer, whether it's in the Christian tradition or in the Platonic tradition, or chanting in Buddhist traditions. These are practices that shut the mind off, or at least stop it from continuing to ruminate about how important we are, or what we're going to get or not get, or is this prayer going to work, or is this the right guru that I'm with, or exactly. How do we stop that? And how do we stop it and have it lead to something,
beautiful.
yeah, beautiful and intelligent as
Mm.
well? That's the trick because how would you put it? I have been wrongly sometimes disparaging of certain new age type of spirituality because it seems so thin mentally or but who's to say actually, Uh, I I think we really need to be discriminating, so using our minds, but we also need to learn how to let go of the mind. And that's not always easy to do. But I think in Christianity, you have the prayers that, in the Philokalia, the prayers that you're familiar with, Gareth, or in Buddhism, there's a lot of certain mantras that they repeat. Uh, don't really know that I suppose you could say that Iamblichus and his theurgical repetition of certain sort of meaningless names
Mm.
could have that effect. And Porphyry says, well, what do they mean? And Iamblichus says, it's not about what they mean. It's about what they don't mean. That's important. Because that's where the most powerful and most sacred things come through, is not knowing. That's hard for an intellectual to accept that, you know?
No, I was doing research today on Damascus and the problems and solutions and all the various different interpretations of Orphism and the proto-hypastic level of chaos and aether and, Chronos, the time god, and like all the various different interpretations. And the thing is that, like, of course, that's all in the world of the ineffable, right? Like, they're talking about the ineffable. So there's going to be a variety of different interpretations. And you know what? The writing of a commentary and trying to figure out and talk about these things is itself the prayer, right? Is itself the
Exactly. The commentary is engaging it as a prayerful act.
Yep.
It's a kind of chanting.
Yep.
Mental chanting is the commentary. And I think that we misunderstand commentaries as some sort of explanation of,
Right.
instead of response to or entering into. It's a way of entering into the temple of the ineffable.
Yeah,
Through the
impenetrable
commentary.
chamber, as Hermias would say, we enter into what cannot be penetrated when we just engage, when we just say, yes, I'm going to write this crazy commentary or this exegesis, or I'm going to try to write down my master's ideas because they're amazing, but they're not writing them down. So here I go, because it shows a devotion, right? A love, a desire, a connection, that we are connected, that you did say something that made my light bulb go off. Oh my God, I'm not alone in the world, because that light bulb means there is a way that we can transcend this separation, right? And it's there all the time. We just give ourselves to that love in whatever kind of prayer it is, whether it be painting a painting or making a manifesto or a commentary. And so I know today we're going to have to close early, and I know that we're going to have a second episode, maybe a third episode on Platonic syncretism or synchronism. But I thought, I have a weird, funny feeling that Gareth has a prayer or a mantra or something.
Before you go to Gareth, I want to hear Gareth's prayer too to close it off. But I think the single point you made, that commentaries are not quote unquote commentaries, but they're ways of entering into prayer, is a huge and important thing, because those Platonists wrote so many commentaries, and I think we misunderstand them if we think of them as just reflections or explanations. Yeah. So, Gareth,
we're commentary that every Platonist has ever made on a PDF. If any of you ever want to pray with those books, I'm the quickest road to that prayer, just in case.
Once these
Robert,
get pushed
what's
on
your
YouTube,
email?
You're going to have 1,000 people asking for your PDFs.
I did it for a friend. He wanted it for that exact reason. Because
Robert, what is your email? Because I'll ask you for these things.
We'll get them. I'll actually forward.
Okay, you can put it in the chat. Okay. So,
Gareth, do you have a way to close?
Okay, I can. Yeah, I can offer something as a concluding prayer. So this is an extract from something from the 11th century Orthodox monk St. Simeon, the new theologian, and it's very short, and maybe touches on some of the things we've spoken about. Solitary, one who is unmixed with the world and continually speaks with God alone. Seeing he is seen, loving, he is loved, and he becomes light, glittering unspeakably.